Okay, so next we have a panel discussion that is being hosted by Anderson Horowitz, the premier VC firm in the Valley. Their investment partner, Joel de la Garza, is running a panelist, and he has Yuri, Feroz, and Dylan, who are participating on the panel, and these are the companies that Anderson works with. So I will pass it on to Joel, who will do the introductions and run the panel discussion.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you so much for coming. This feels a bit like a sports center debrief after a Warriors game, right? Anyway, sorry, I like to open with a joke, but they're always flat. So it's great, thanks everyone for coming again. We're gonna talk a bit about supply chain and security. So as you heard in probably some of the discussions today, the supply chain is getting moved around quite a bit, both offshore, nearshore, and in country now. So we've got a lot of different threats and material issues that have emerged. On the panel, we'll go through, and I'm Joel de la Garza, we'll go through and do some introductions of some of our founders from our portfolio companies. And these are all founders who are building companies and technology that is focused on securing your supply chain. So making sure that wherever you happen to be building or whatever you happen to be building, you don't get any sort of bad security things happening inside of it. And so maybe we'll kick off and go through an introduction, and folks can give a background and a bit on what they're building, and then we can talk about some real world examples of kind of how the supply chain falls over. That sounds good. So Feroz, I'll kick it over to you.
Hey everybody, I'm Feroz, CEO and founder of Socket Security. And Socket is a company that helps other companies use open source software safely. So most modern applications today are built on the foundation of thousands of open source dependencies. In fact, even just getting a Hello World application off the ground is hard to do using less than thousands of dependencies, honestly, in today's applications. And so this is in one way kind of the power of open source. We've seen kind of this explosion in creativity and in reused software across the whole industry, which has made it so easy and so quick to build software. But one of the downsides of this approach is that you end up with an application depending on hundreds or thousands of different maintainers, different individuals across the world in hundreds of countries. In fact, just as one example, the Discord application has, I think, about 20,000 dependencies today. And from those people who work on those come from 206 countries. So this is the kind of reach we're dealing with in the software supply chain. And so basically what Socket does is we help companies understand that risk and characterize it, and then stop bad dependencies from getting in. And so a bad dependency can be something that's vulnerable, but it also could be something that's maliciously modified, compromised in some way. And so yeah, that's Socket.
Awesome, thank you. And Dylan, maybe you could tell us a bit about Truffle Security and where you guys focus and what you do.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. So my name's Dylan. My background is in security research, so I've been doing novel security research for the better part of a decade or so, which is really just a polite way of saying I'm a hacker, I guess. So for a long time, I mean, I think it's really attractive for security researchers to focus on novelty, and sometimes it's at the expense of practicality. So for example, if you want to hack a self-driving car, the novelty of that might make it tempting to show if you put a fancy sign up on the side of the road or something like that, you can cause the car to swerve off the road. But it kind of ignores the fact if you're actually physically there on the side of the road, there are easier ways to cause a car crash. And so that's an example of maybe novelty taking the lead over practicality. So I decided to just flip that on its head a couple years ago. I said, what is the easiest way to break into a company, and let me make a tool that just specifically focuses on the practicality aspect of it. And it turns out the easiest way to break into most companies is to just log in, to just sign in with a username and password. And so I wrote a tool called TruffleHog. It's an open source tool that just finds passwords that people accidentally post online. Maybe your software developers accidentally post their database passwords on github.com, for example. The tool is very good at very quickly finding those passwords. And I published it as a research tool, but instantly, overnight, it exploded in popularity because it turns out there were hundreds of thousands of passwords and API keys on github.com. And so you had hackers using the tool to find those keys to break into places, and you had defenders using the tool to find those keys before the hackers did. And that caused the tool to just blow up overnight, and every security professional started using it all at once, which I wasn't expecting, because it was this thing I hacked out on my couch one day, and not something I was expecting would be the front page of a bunch of breach headlines a couple weeks later. But that's what ended up happening, and it was a side project for a long time, but the tool continued to grow in popularity. The problem, it continued to resonate with companies as more and more passwords leaked out, and at some point it just became so popular it didn't make sense for me to work my day job anymore. So I quit as a security professional at Netflix and decided to co-found Truffle Security, which focuses on preventing passwords and API keys from leaking out of big companies.
Awesome, thank you. And last and certainly not least, Yuri, can we hear a bit maybe about Eclipsium and where you're focused on the supply chain?
Thank you, Joel, and it's a pleasure to be here with my co-speakers here. Yuri Bulligan, CEO, co-founder of Eclipsium, 5-year-old company. I guess I have fairly similar background to Dylan. I've been for a better part of my prior life, I've been looking for vulnerabilities, in charge of product security assurance and securing a lot of systems that Intel Corporation has been building. And at some point we saw a wave of nation-state sponsored attacks against equipment of various manufacturers. Network manufacturers, server manufacturers, PC manufacturers, and we saw implants that have been introduced for primarily espionage purposes at the time. I've been helping the impacted manufacturers to understand how those implants, how their equipment could have been compromised and was compromised, and how those implants could get into those systems. At some point, it was even interesting. One of the manufacturers sent a system to me that was a new generation that would have come out in a few months, and essentially, yeah, you can hack it. You cannot hack it. And just after minutes of running our tools, we bricked it and never booted again. So that was interesting. But then we saw that there was an interest from the manufacturing community to understand how their equipment was hacked. And so we decided to develop an open source project, and ultimately open sourced a tool called ChipSec that is now kind of a de facto standard in the hardware security space. And one of the large companies here in the Valley, the internet scale companies, became huge fans of it and started running it against all of the equipment that they've been purchasing and publishing some results, including, here we found some equipment that has been tampered with, or that had some massive vulnerabilities in the hardware or system code, firmware in that equipment that we rely our infrastructure on. So they became pretty big fans and contributors, and continue to be so. But to me and my co-founder Alex, it was pretty clear that nobody knows what's going on with their equipment that they rely on. They rely their enterprise infrastructure or even critical infrastructure. So there had to be a set of capabilities or tools that would allow any organization to understand what are they getting as their equipment that they rely on and use. So that's how we started. What Eclipsium is doing, essentially, we did two things, ultimately. A lot more, but two things largely. One is we built a huge catalog of all equipment, ICT equipment, that is typically used in critical infrastructure and enterprise infrastructure. Anything from laptops, PCs, to servers, to network gear, to storage gear, all of that. And we have that catalog. We mapped, what they're made of, all of the components, the vulnerabilities, threat actors, expected integrity, all of that. And we have that catalog. But we also built an operational product that our customers now use to run against their infrastructure and compare with expected state of their infrastructure from that catalog to discover any sort of supply chain tampering, implants, or even vulnerabilities in all of that equipment. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. And so, I think it always helps for us to we're used to speaking to mostly technical security audiences, so I think sometimes when communicating, what a lot of folks are building in this space, it's good to maybe speak in terms of examples of what happens. And so just for folks in the audience, you're probably aware, but whenever you're building something in a country that isn't yours, you always have to be worried that that host country is trying to do something to your supply chain, right? And the holy grail in the last couple of years has been finding ways to insert malicious code or some malicious element into that supply chain. And so we've had a bunch of hacks and a bunch of very big breaches of large companies where people and nation states have gotten into their supply chain. It may be software, it may be hardware, but they've inserted some kind of an implant that could then be used to go after the customers of the company that's producing that software or that product. And so, for us, I think you've found quite a few of these very disturbing things because you've built this tool that can go into the software and actually find where malicious stuff has happened. Do you have any really crazy examples of the things you've been finding and maybe some of the stuff you've been doing with large language models?
Yeah, totally. So, absolutely. Yeah, we have a tool that scans every single open source package that's being published in real time, and we're looking for not just vulnerabilities, but actually signs of supply chain attacks. So, intentionally inserted malware or a code that shouldn't be there. And when you start to look for this stuff, it starts coming out. You see it everywhere, and it's. One of the things that has been so eye-opening to us is, before we started doing this, the industry was pretty focused on just looking for known vulnerabilities. So, basically reporting on known security issues and not looking for this sort of supply chain attacks and other types of risks. And so we found a bunch of stuff that's quite interesting. But I can share a few stories of some of the more prominent attacks. Maybe folks have even heard of some of these. But in one example, there's an open source project, very, very widely used, millions and millions of downloads per month. It's in almost every JavaScript project. And one of the things that happens with open source is you have, maintainers get tired of doing this maintenance work, and so they'll often be quite open and receptive to folks that volunteer to do some of this work and contribute to the project. And so in this one example that I'm speaking of, there was a maintainer who got added to a project, and it turned out to be a malicious actor. And it's very hard when you're running a project to kind of know who these people are and what they're going to do, especially when you're at a stage where you're, I would say, burned out and not even working on the project anymore. And so this happens all the time in open source. You'll have ownership changes. So somebody will just hand over a project to another person. And all the companies that are depending on that software are now depending on a completely new individual, different person than they trusted originally. And so, when that happens, that person can do whatever they'd like with the project. And so they inserted malicious code in this instance. And it was very sneaky because it was designed to only run in a particular customer environment. So most of the community didn't know that anything had happened. So this was a malicious backdoor. And it ended up getting built into this company's project and deployed, and a bunch of customers were affected. And then this was only uncovered by the community by a total accident. And so there's no systemic sort of scanning or looking for this type of stuff. But we've also seen other types of incidents, maintainers making political statements around different activist causes that they believe in and using their open source as a vehicle to convey those messages. In one very, very prominent example, somebody actually added code to a project used by, again, pretty much everybody, including, it most prominently was used in the Amazon Cloud Development Kit, or CDK, which is used by everybody who uses AWS. And this code would delete your hard drive if you appeared to be coming from, appeared to have an IP address from Russia. So, literally would replace every file on your hard drive with a flower emoji, and I don't know why, but yeah, and of course, this can misfire. It can run on your computer if the IP address is detected incorrectly there. So this is the kind of stuff that people do, and it can be quite destructive. So, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really scary stuff, and I hope to never have to encounter it. So thanks for building that. Mm-hmm. I think Dylan, you guys make a really interesting product that finds the leakage of sensitive information, specifically secrets. So think passwords, think API keys, stuff that gives you access to things. And I believe just through some of your open source scanning, you've probably found the secrets of most of the Fortune 100. I'm kind of curious sort of what you're seeing and kind of the way that the cyber threat landscape and the supply chain threat landscape has changed in the way that these secrets kind of get out and the damage that they can cause.
Yeah, so let's say I'm a hacker and I want to hack into you. How many people by show of hands use Uber? Most hands go up. How many people use Twitter? Most hands go up. I mean, what does your personal supply chain look like of all the different places you've put your data? Uber's had every single user record of their platform leaked out because they accidentally had an Amazon token posted to github.com. Amazon is where all the big companies store all their data. The tokens are what allow you to access all that data. The developer posted online, got access to every single person who raised their hand's data. Similar with Twitter, somebody shared a password in a chat platform that was insecure, and it gave an attacker access to an internal portal that gave them access to everyone's data. And that's actually what caused that celebrity account takeover a couple years ago. If you remember Obama tweeting out saying, if you give me a Bitcoin, I'll give you 2 back. Same deal. And so in the last year, 50,000 Amazon tokens were posted on github.com, probably accidentally in most cases. The path to get access to your data, or the path to break into a big company, is what is the easiest company to break into that gives me the access that I want, not what's the most challenging company. And so for the people that put their hands up for those companies, think about all the different places you've stored your data and think of the least secure place. If by some miracle your company hasn't exposed an API key, if they're not one of the 50,000 that leaked out in the last year, all the different sub-vendors and processors that that company works with and shares data with almost certainly has. And so that's really the challenge that we're facing, both on the personal side for the people that raise their hands up. Unfortunately, the companies that you're sharing your data with are exposing your data in ways that you may be eligible for class action lawsuits in some cases. And on the corporate side, big companies work with lots of other companies, and really it's just the lowest hanging fruit, the easiest company to hack into, to give that hacker the access to the larger company that they want to get access to.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, as investors in Lyft, we would suggest you take that home. But yeah, Uber's also okay. Just joking. So let's maybe transition. Yuri, you focus on actual software implants in physical things. And, I think we've talked several times. There was some great reporting by Jordan Robertson at Bloomberg about how we shipped all of our manufacturing of microchips to China and firmware to China. And it seemed like, according to the reporting, not my personal statement, but it seemed like there were implants that were coming with some of these things that we weren't anticipating. And so Yuri, you're very focused on making sure that the stuff you buy, right, whether it's a server in a data center or maybe a camera in the data center, actually doesn't have any adulterated software on it, anything that's been tampered with. So maybe you could share some stories. I know you've been very active with a number of different causes lately around involving global conflict. So would love to maybe hear some stories you've got about some of the things that have been happening.
Awesome. Thank you, Joel. Absolutely. Now I'll be speaking about the hardware part of the supply chain, although there is no hardware supply chain, really. All of you probably heard that that statement from Mark Andreessen at some point that software is eating the world. So software has eaten hardware, as all of us know. There's so much software running inside hardware. That's mind blowing. It's each server. If we take a server, it may have 100 different components running different kinds of software, some kind of a firmware, system code, and so on and so forth. Some data centers in Singapore and China recently, a month ago, got breached because of a management chip or vulnerable software running in a management chip of servers of major manufacturers. That's a good example. Now we find all kinds of things in the hardware supply chain or that software hardware supply chain, both at the level of the manufacturers who may be compromised or targeted by threat actors, but also at the level of organizations who use equipment of manufacturers and as a result get compromised because of that equipment, because maybe vulnerabilities in there, maybe because of some update practices, software update practices are not there, and so on and so forth. It's a good example, I think. I would bring a couple of examples. One is over the last year, a decade ago, and I started with nation-state attacks. Nation-states have leveraged those attacks for quite a while. But over just a year, ransomware actors have switched from phishing as top infection vector to exploiting vulnerabilities in connected equipment as the top vector. Now almost 40% of all ransomware infections are because of exploiting vulnerabilities versus phishing, which is number 3 vector today. So that, and we hear about hundreds of companies in across the globe compromised because of network manufacturers, because of vulnerable unpatched appliances from network manufacturers, Pulse Secure and Fortinet and F5 load balancers and all of these. So that's a good example of how that spilled over to the enterprise, to the commercial sector, where a nation state primarily attack vectors in the past have now become the top attack vector to to compromise any organization. And then the second good example I like to use is the Viasat hack. The Viasat hack happened an hour before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, where a vulnerable network appliance was used to compromise an organization, a subsidiary of Viasat in Europe that was Fortinet VPN appliance. And then the threat actors took over the management network or management system of a ground satellite modems that connect to KSAT network of satellites and propagated malicious firmware updates, well, because of vulnerabilities in those modems, and bricked multiple thousands of them. That caused a tremendous impact on the connectivity, critical connectivity in the first hours and days of war, but also it spilled over to the private sector, where almost 6,000 wind turbines in Germany went offline, couldn't be managed remotely, and even after a month, only 40% of those wind turbines were recovered. So Viasat had to ship thousands of modems to replace that infrastructure. It's part of critical infrastructure, and we see those attacks now being used by threat actors to, to compromise both the critical infrastructure of Ukraine and Europe, but also commercial infrastructure of companies, U.S. companies like Viasat. So these are the type of threats that we're facing now. And the reason is because all of that supply chain is extremely complex. As you all know, a typical device like a server, it is built by hundreds, if not more, suppliers that build components, that write code, that put that all together, and a typical network switch is built in 16 countries. So that is the complexity of the supply chain that we have, and every organization now is the victim of risks in that supply chain.
Awesome, thank you. So I think we've only got 30 minutes today, so that was a really wonderful overview of how you can protect the different parts of your supply chain. And I'd like for everyone to please give a round of applause to our esteemed founders from our portfolio companies, and hopefully you got something out of this. Thank you very much.